Hi guys, this is Mike Hibbert back with another Python Django tutorial for you. This time round we're going to take our last tutorial a step further in that we looked at templates and how to create a base template for the whole site. And we also looked at the styling of the site and how it applied to all the different pages so that you could apply CSS to your sites. And here's the CSS that we included last time. This time what we're going to do is we're going to start moving that out and storing it in a separate CSS file. As well as that, we're going to show how to include other files like an image, for instance, and that will help us to be able to know how to separate these other files which just get included into the HTML. In Django, these are known as static files. I don't know if you've done any web programming before, you may not call this static files in something like PHP, but they're just basically files that need to be included that aren't necessarily code. So for instance, CSS images, or even if you're doing a link to a PDF or something like that, then static files is the thing you need to help get your users to be able to download that content into that browser. So first of all, what we need to do is we need to establish where we're going to keep our static files. So inside of our Django project folder, I've created a static folder with two folders in it: CSS with a default CSS file in there, and that basically contains what's in here. So I've just basically cut and pasted it out and put it into this default CSS file. Back in the static folder, I've also got an images folder, and I've included the Python logo that I use for these videos just as a test image, and that's where I'm going to keep my static files. Now this isn't the folder that Django will look in to find static files at the time when you actually go to download them through the web page. What Django needs to do is it needs to register these files into a set of files that the URL system can then link to. And the reason why that it's not straightforward in that you can just link to it straight through a URL without having to do any programming or taking any records or registering files is because Django has a system where it doesn't necessarily have to serve files from your web server. If you've got something like a content delivery network, something like Amazon Web Services or something like that, you can also include that, and you can do that without necessarily having to rewire your whole website. So to make it more flexible, Django says that when you're serving static files, it needs to register them if it's going to be on your web server, and if you want to change the back-end system to point somewhere else later, it's not going to hit you hard at that point in time. So all of this gets done in development time, and later on if you need to change configurations, that's when it becomes easier. So this might seem a little bit more complex than it seems it should be, but it does benefit you in the long run. So we're storing our files in this static folder. How do we tell Django about the folder? Well, we go into our settings.py and we have three different options. We have the static root, which is where the root folder for all static information will be, and in our case, because we're in development mode, the root is in this Django test folder that we've got, which is our project folder. So everything that we pull in terms of files will be pulled into this folder here, and that's okay for development. Once you actually get onto a deployed server, then you can actually change that setting and have it somewhere out of the way of your code, which would probably be better for you. And then obviously that's giving you a level of abstraction or decoupling from the file system. Hence you can then start and include things like Amazon Web Services to start and serve files, because they're not coupled together and not bound together. So that's what that static root setting is for. The static URL setting is basically what we're going to tack on to the end of a web address. So static on here would be, for instance, static CSS, although that's not a valid path at the minute because we haven't actually got our web service switched on, or our web server rather. So static, and then CSS would be a folder within static, and then our file name. So this static URL actually refers to the part on the URL that we need to tell Django about, so it can route through from our web server to the file system on the server. Because obviously we've got URLs for things like articles, which we set up earlier. We've got URLs for the admin system, which we set up in previous examples. In this case, we also have to set up a generic URL that will automatically tell the web server, this is not code that I want to execute. I want you to go through and find this specific binary file and download it, rather than actually run it as a script. So that's how we tell Django that whenever somebody accesses a URL with that part in it, we know it's going to be a download file. The next section is static files dir, and this is where we tell Django about our static folder that we've been creating inside of the project. Now, this doesn't necessarily have to be anywhere inside of the project. It could be just in your hard drive. You could put it in your documents folder if you wanted to put the files there. It's just for the sake of showing you how it works that I've kept it in there. So the path to this place can be anywhere you like, really. I've put it in this path here, and when the static files loader goes through, it will look for the files in this folder here, and then it will go and create another folder where it accepts the files to be part of the system when Django's running, and it's going to create an assets folder. Now that's going to be, in our case, alongside the static folder in here, but it's also going to pull in some other stuff. The other things that it can pull in are things like JavaScript or CSS files or image files to do with the admin system as well, because we haven't yet touched upon bringing in these static files for the other systems that are a part of that. But you'll see in a second that it actually doesn't just stop at what we've told it. It'll go and say we have the admin system included into the Django build, so we need to pull in the files for that. So we've told it where to get these files for our particular static files. We've told it that this is where our CSS and images will all exist. We now need to update our template. So the template needs to stop using that old CSS and needs to start using the new CSS. So what we're going to do is we're going to link to the CSS file, and we're going to use this logical tag. So remember I said curly braces and percentage for something that actually does something more than just referencing a variable, and in this case it uses a tag called static. Static is not a standard template and tag. You have to load it in. So you might remember from the last example, I showed you that you can use tags for various things, and you can actually extend Django to add more tags, and in this case that's what's happened because of Django version 1.4 onwards. Instead of using a strange kind of static URL kind of tag, we now use this custom tag, which is much more sensible and works a lot more in terms of the idea of template and language. So we're using static to say this is a static file, pull it into here. We're which is where our assets folder is, CSS default. So you remember we said once Django has pulled through the system and established that we have static files to serve, it'll put them in the assets folder. So we're going to say it's in the assets folder under the CSS folder, and the name of the file is default CSS. Then the next thing we need to do is we need to just introduce this static tag. Just type that right. Excuse me. So we say load the static tag so that we can begin using it in our templating language. And next I'm going to include an image. Lower down in the page I'm going to include that Python logo that we loaded in. And again I'm going to use the static tag to say in the assets folder under images there's a Python logo that I want to use, and it's the source for this image tag in the HTML. So having done that, we should now be able to call a new function that works off the manage.py script, and it's called collect static. Now what that does is it looks at the settings in the settings.py file, and it says what places on the file system have we said we should go and look. So it looks at this path that we've defined, and it also goes and has a look through the admin systems paths and establishes a list of files that need to be pulled in, and then it'll pull them into this Django test folder, our project folder. Now what we should see is we should see an assets folder created and also an admin folder. So the admin folder is for the actual admin system and should contain all sorts of stuff like JavaScript and CSS, and our assets folder should more or less contain the same as what our static folder contains. And those two folders that it will create will then be registered as folders where you can keep static assets like images, CSS, JavaScript, or even PDFs, or even downloadable software if you want to do that sort of thing. So going back to our console, we need to run python manage.py collect static just to build up that list of files and have them registered with the static file system so that they can be served through our web server. Now it's saying how you've requested to collect static files at the destination location as specified in your settings. This will overwrite your files. Are you sure you want to do this? Yes, we are. And there you go, there's a massive big list. Some of these are admin files, so JavaScript coming in from the admin files. Right at the top, if I can see it, yep, here we are. There's our default CSS, our Python logo that's been pulled in. Now that we've done that, we can start the web server, and hopefully we won't have any errors. So I'm going to go to the web service, or the web page rather, and here you go. That's loaded in our CSS, and as you can see it's applied to every page because it's part of our base HTML that we did, and it's also included in our image. So now that we've got that open, let's do a little tweak, because I think that this image is not ours far too big, so I'm just going to say width equals 200. I know this is not the right way to do it. You should be doing it with CSS if you're going to do sizing with images and that sort of thing, but for the sake of quickness, there you go. So what actually happens? Well, if you've got something like Firebug in Firefox or in Google Chrome, you'll be able to inspect the element and look at the actual HTML underneath. What it's actually done is it's taken our static URL that we set up in the settings pie and it prepended it to the folder name so that our tag's done that. It's also done that for our CSS here. And that's literally all that static tag does in the HTML. But if this was on a different web server, for instance something that you'd already had hosted somewhere on the World Wide Web, and instead of your local machine, your settings in your settings.py file would be slightly different, and also your static URL would be different, and perhaps it might have your website address on there. For instance, the default comments come along with an example of a website address that it would be, and as you can see, the static part is just tacked onto the end of the URL, and that would change when you get it deployed onto the web server. But for the time being, we are using a relative URL which just tacks onto the end of there. Let's just see if I can open image in a new tab. There we go. So this is the full path here that we're just tacking onto the end of our web server. And that's literally how the static file system works. There are more complicated ways of doing things, and they're possibly outside the scope of this tutorial, but I hope that that's gotten you enough to the point where you can actually link in CSS and JavaScript and some images onto your websites. If you enjoyed this tutorial or it helped you out in any way, then please click the like button. If you'd like to know more about Django or any of the other tutorials that I'm publishing on this YouTube channel, then please click subscribe, and thanks for watching.